Welcome to the Route 77 podcast, the go-to place for Christian singles seeking guidance, inspiration, and community. In today's episode, we're diving deep into the history and theology of singleness and marriage within the Christian faith, and how these beliefs have evolved and impacted singles in the church. Join us as we explore the different perspectives and discuss the challenges that modern Christian singles face in their journey. So sit back, relax, and let's embark on this journey together. Welcome to the Route 77 podcast. I am your host, Natasha. I am here with Monique.
Hello.
And David.
Hello.
And we are going to talk about the history of singleness through the ages and the church. I thought this would be an interesting one to have a summary of how we went from in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and Adam and Eve, and then moved to now times and what'll happen within singleness and marriage. I recently did a paper on this, so it's fresh in my mind, and it was very interesting to do this paper. What has your guys' feeling? Did you ever think about the history of singleness? Did you have this sort of assumption on it? Was it not even in your radar?
Not even in my radar. If I think about it, obviously the Bible is our history kind of thing. But like most people, you get that Genesis verse, go out into all the world and prosper and fill the earth and all that kind of stuff and subdue it. You're supposed to get married, have kids, and on you go. So singleness was almost you weren't really supposed to be. Thinking that singles in the church was a thing was not really a thing.
Coming into the church later in life.
Yep.
Did you feel like their view of singleness was different from what you had believed before? It's not coming from a secular perspective.
What do you mean?
Like when you came into the church, did you feel like your view of singleness changed, or was basically just the same culturally as it was when before you were Christian? It's just whatever it is, what it is.
Yeah, I think it was pretty much the same. Yeah, there was
Like
not. Yeah, there was not a difference. Mind you, I wasn't really pastored or mentored about being a single. When I went into the church as a new Christian, I actually wasn't single. I was living with my boyfriend, who was the father of my child. And then I became a Christian and then was told by a friend that I was committing a sin. I was living in sin, even though I think I was maybe just a couple months a Christian. And I what does that mean? I don't know what you mean. I knew what sin was, but living in sin, but he's the father of my baby kind of thing. So it was like, you're supposed to, if he's not going to marry you, you've got to leave him. So then I became a forced single, I guess you could say. Yeah. So I didn't really understand. So for me, it was more, now I'm a single mom. So now I've got to find a husband. So there was no, you should try to live your single life. There was no teaching for that at all.
No, sorry. As far as you're aware, there was no real teaching of being single.
No. And my friend was a church hopper. She was never satisfied in any of the churches that she dragged me to. I say dragged me to because that first church that we were going to was a Foursquare church. And I was comfortable there. I was happy there. And then but she was a Pentecostal. So she wasn't getting enough of the feeling. She had more of the feeling. So she found us a little church that was in a library that I think was maybe 20 people tops. And I just went, all right, whatever. So that church for sure didn't teach anything on singleness. That pastor actually called me the Jezebel.
That's where the Jezebel came in.
That's where the Jezebel came in, yeah. But I might have gotten it at the Foursquare church had we stayed, but I didn't get a chance.
So as far as you're aware, you didn't have any teaching on singleness growing up.
No.
How about you, David?
None. I never even gave it a thought, really.
And the different churches that you went to and stuff, was there any sort of teaching on singleness or anything? It was just the place in between childhood and marriage?
To be honest with you, I can't recall. We moved around a lot to the point where we never really were able to settle down in a church. And I can't recall hearing anything about having any sermons or anything on singleness or relationships. It's just been blank.
Yeah. Even after my husband passed away, or even before he passed away, because I've been going to the churches ever since. And I've gone to other churches, like I've gone to the Evangelical Free before I landed here at Gateway. And there may have been a sermon or two about singleness, but not much delved into. And I did try to go to a few singles groups, but they were Yeah, they were, let's pair you up with somebody. I don't think that's what their intent was, but that's what your attitude was going there.
That's definitely what I thought of. Like when you go there, it's just to find the meat market, right? You just go to find the person that you're supposed to marry and you're going to try really hard to make it work. And
Yeah.
then you look at the people and you're like,
Yeah, they were all 25 plus over age for me. So that was awkward. So, yeah, not quite there yet.
yeah, like I was probably the same. Like I grew up in one church, I like a reformed church. It was the same church up until I was 30. So I had a steady flow. And I like perhaps there were sermons on singleness, but as far as I'm aware, I don't really recall them. I don't recall there being any sort of theology about being single, which I think is very important. But there's always this focus on becoming a wife and a mother. That was like your whole goal in life. Like that was the highest calling you could have was wife and mother.
I've heard that's a reformed thought, actually.
It, I think, has developed over time in the Reformed Church. And I never want to say that's not a high calling, because being a wife and mother is a high calling, but it's not the high calling and it's not the only high calling. So like your entire is geared towards being single, or being married, sorry.
Yeah.
So geared towards being married. So you don't even give singleness a thought. It's just this place in between. Yeah, like I said, like becoming an adult, sort of after childhood, after a young person finishing school and becoming married. It was this that you're trying to make as short as possible. Like that's really the goal. And so when I started doing my master's, what sort of started me down this road was I did a paper on clerical celibacy and where that came from. So what was the history of that? Why did the Catholic Church become so adamant about clerical celibacy? And that is just a small photo, like a small snapshot of actually the view of singleness that has developed over time with the church. So it was actually interesting because I did the church history part 1, which is when I did the clerical celibacy paper. And this was for church history part 2 was the history of singleness. So actually one just built on top of the other one. So it really opened my eyes to how we got to where we are, especially in the Reformed churches. But that's definitely how I came to this point. Yeah. So I would like to start at the very beginning. So the verse in the word, no, like in the beginning, God created heavens and earth, all that way back in Genesis. And that's the verse that Monique referred to. It's in Genesis 1:28 or somewhere in that area. And it basically is God's mandate. It says, be fruitful and multiply. And this sort of became the mantra of
Churches.
the churches. It was that in the current history is that we need to be fruitful and multiply. So
Come on, there was like 2 people back then.
I know, right? So yeah, there's a few more people now than there was then.
What did they say our population now is? About 6 or 8 billion people?
Yeah, somewhere in
Probably around 7 to 8.
Yeah.
7, 8 billion.
Crazy.
So it fluctuates constantly depending on societies and stuff. But yeah,
And if you're Catholic, you don't use birth control. Wow.
yeah. Only if you're like Protestant Reformed, then you don't use birth control because you're trying to make what you can, but you're trying to make as many babies as possible. So
Yes.
again, there's nothing wrong if you want to do that. But if it's your whole gear in life, there's a difference between choosing that out of your own free will thing and thinking that's what you're supposed to be doing, your destiny.
Yeah. I remember when my best friend Michelle and I were in high school, our whole adult life plan was to get married and have the baker's dozen. Not her and I. She would marry somebody and I would marry somebody and we would each have a baker's dozen.
Yeah, so then you'd each have a soccer team that you could play
Pretty
against
much.
each other.
Yeah. And having given birth, I'm really glad I didn't do that.
One was enough for the
Well,
moment.
to be fair, I would have liked to have had more children. A baker's dozen is just not way too many kids.
So we look at Genesis and we look at the Old Testament, and there's not much teaching about being single within the Old Testament. It's actually all based around the family and progeny and building a lineage. So even if you look at a lot of the laws that God created as Israel became a nation, and there was a whole idea of even if a man died without having a son or children, then his wife was to marry like his brother, and their firstborn would be the count as their first husband's baby. So there's this whole idea that you have to create this lineage. If you didn't, then it was considered a curse. And if you were a barren woman, that was like the worst thing possible. Like God does not love you. He That was the feeling of the people, I think, but not maybe. I don't think that's what God does, but there was this idea that if you were barren or you didn't have sons, especially, then you were being cursed by God or you weren't in his blessing.
Yeah.
So you go from that sort of structured family time where God, like it is during the creation and the flying of the earth so that we fill the earth. And then we hit the New Testament with Paul saying in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 7, which is our ministry verse, that I wish that you could all be as I am, which is single, but we're not all called to this. One is one gift of singleness, one is one gift of marriage. And even Paul says later in that chapter, he's going, if you can, stay single. And for the widows out there, if you can, just stay single. So there's this idea that, hey, there's lots to be said about being single. And so that's like a complete about face from the Old Testament when it's dealing with the family unit or being married, being single, having children.
We have a very strong person on our side who was single right up to his death. Jesus.
Jesus, he managed to do some things with his singleness.
Yep.
A
Oh,
few.
he did a few things. Yeah. Raising the dead, walking on water.
Redeeming.
I haven't accomplished any of those yet.
No.
Walking on water is
That's
cool.
like the first, maybe like the first thing to try.
Some people say maybe changing wine into water because, we're reforms.
There you go.
Water into wine. But even Jesus had said himself, about singleness, for there are eunuchs who have been from birth, eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and they are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 19, verse 12. I don't think a person has actually made themselves, but he's talking.
There were people later on that actually did make themselves eunuchs, but that was the people. The church pushed back against that a little bit. That's not what they meant.
Yeah, let's not be literal. There are many things that Jesus had said that I don't think we're supposed to. If your eye sins, pluck it out.
Yeah,
all of us walking around without our eyes. Yeah, so I think making yourself a eunuch, holding yourself back, and being celibate. For the kingdom of God.
Yeah, for the kingdom. For not just for your own selfish reasons or purposes, but it's actually for God's work that you're doing this. You're choosing this.
Choosing to remain single for the ministry, for faith.
That's solid. That's just on point.
Solid.
Good. So as we come through the New Testament and we hit to just like after pretty much what's going on in the New Testament, we start getting into the time of persecution. This is when you have Christians being burned alive, put into the arena, they're cast out, all these things are happening throughout the known world at the time. And this happens for about approximately 300 years. There's this persecution. It goes like from smaller to larger. And so for about 300 years, there's this massive persecution happening to Christians. And within that, some of the people survived the persecution. They survived some of these horrific things. And there was an awe of the person from the other believers that they're almost like super Christians because they were able to survive this torture or some persecution that like their faith was so strong that they could survive it. So there became this, I don't think it's like official super Christian title, but there was this idea that you were even more Christian because you survived.
Did they have capes?
No, I don't think they had cloaks, but maybe not capes.
Oh, cloaks, but not capes.
Yeah. So
did they have any other superpowers?
Yeah, I'm just surviving. Surviving is their superpower.
Surviving is their superpower.
Mustard seed of faith.
Yeah. So there was this idea that they were somehow like more holy, more faithful, more something. And when that persecution died down, there wasn't really a way to become super Christian because the persecution was dying down. So that's when people started to move over to the asceticism. So denying of your body, your physical pleasures, anything like that. So that became the new super Christian.
It's funny because didn't Justin talk about that this morning?
Yes, Pastor Justin talked about the Gnostics and Docetism, where essentially you were denying like the flesh is evil and the spiritual is good. And that became like a mainline thinking of the time. So you denied your flesh. And some people would even do like self-flagellation where they would punish themselves with whips or they'd all these things, and they would deny themselves food, and they would go and they would deny themselves any sort of comfort. They deny themselves even like fellowship with other people. They would go out to the desert and they become like these hermits. And so the desert was a place to really get away from things. because it was harsh. And so that was the new way to become
The
super Christian.
Mm.
Yes. So with that becomes the denial of the body for sex.
So and that's when men would castrate themselves.
Sometimes, yeah, that's when they were getting overzealous and doing that. So they would deny themselves any sort of physical pleasure. And that would include sex. And actually it became a thing where people who were married would actually deny themselves sex, even though they were married, husband and wife. They would be like, we're husband and wife, but we're not going to fall to this, like the temptations of the body, because we need to be super Christians. And so singleness and celibacy became on a pedestal. So all of a sudden we go from, we must get married, have children, still populate the earth, to Paul saying either way is good. And we should choose to be single if you can, but you can be married and that's fine too. To no, we must be single because that's the way to be super Christian. That's the more faithful. That's the more heroic. I don't know. It's the way to be more Christian.
So that pendulum swung pretty wildly on
Yes.
go from one extreme to the other. And we're trying to balance that.
Yes, we
pendulum.
are trying to balance that.
Yeah.
And I think Paul was, and even the reformers will talk about that, how they tried to balance that, but it just swings from one end to the other.
Because people are silly.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're
Two extremes.
we are people that react. I think generally people in general react, but they overreact instead of going, oh, we can't do this, so we're going to overreact and do this. I think that's where we talked about maturity culture. That's where a lot of maturity culture came back from. We were going from recreational dating. Let's not do that. Let's overreact and go to the complete opposite instead of finding a middle ground, which is actually healthier. So right here, we're overreacting to, I don't even know what, because they were just trying to be find their way to be most holy. And so they were going, we can't do it just being living. Yes.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head why they would do all of that. Why would they go to the extreme if they didn't want some kind of attention like the Pharisees did when they prayed out in the synagogues and stuff?
If I'm not mistaken, I believe I remember hearing a story about Martin Luther putting himself in a box because he could not handle the amount of sin in his life. So he thought if he could just sit in a box and not leave the box, then he would not sin.
Yes, but that's completely different because the box would be isolation.
Yes. But
The idea of becoming a super Christian, the fact that was a title or label then means that they expected themselves to be elevated above other people, as
And
the
yet
Pharisees expected to be elevated once they were praying out in public.
we even see this with the apostles when they were saying which one of us is greater?
Yeah.
Or can my son sit on one at your right hand and one at your left hand?
Yeah.
There's this idea of being the best, being better than just average.
I want God to look at me as really special. I know you guys are all special, but I want God to look at me as really special.
That's the thing. I'm holy, but I'm ascetic holy.
Yes.
I think there is definitely a Pharisaical view of it where you're trying to get other people to see what you're doing. But I think there was a dual. I think, there's getting people to see what you're doing, but also you're actually trying to get God to see what you're doing. So a little bit of that prosperity thing going in there, I think, where, hey, if I do this, then I'm going to get some sort of reward from God, even though
it still doesn't make sense. Because if they're trying to get some kind of response out of God, wasn't Jesus coming to earth a response for everything they've been doing kind of thing? So Jesus was the response. And his response was, you're sinners. You sin. Stop trying to get a response because I'm giving my son to you so that you may be freed from this, so that you don't need to do that in a sense.
I agree. But I think we're not very rational when it comes to these things as humankind. No, we have a tendency to try to do things ourselves. Christ's work was enough. There's nothing we can do that can in any way bring us closer to God outside of Christ. And yet we still try.
We still have that verse that says faith without works is dead. So we know about faith, but we really feel like we've got to do something as well to prove our faith. They are taking it to the extreme by doing.
And I think too, by getting to a certain point, then it became the thing to do.
Yep.
So then everybody starts doing it.
Yep.
In their own way of doing it. Like I said, where they're not even having sex as married couples. Like we're married, but so we can't really divorce because it says don't divorce, but let's try to figure out this asceticism within the marriage.
Is that how a lot of the Catholic Church priests came about?
That is where it came into where it became a higher level of being, like
Okay.
holiness. And so as the Catholic Church comes out of the Christianity, as it develops, it became more, like it's the thing that you should do, especially if you're a pastor or you're a priest or something, you should be up higher. Like you should be comporting yourself better than the common man. And it's funny, like it started off that way, but as time went on, it became much more
Political?
yes, much more political. Because at that point, like you had most of the priests going, yeah, whatever, I'm having a family and if I'm having a wife and kids. And then all of the churches and stuff were actually being handed down from father to son. And like the church was losing wealth within a family thing. So by saying you can't be married and have a family, then there's no one to leave it to. So that was one way of trying to deal with that. Another way was to actually, there was actually simony going on, which was like actually the buying and selling of church parishes, which is also the whole thing about buying it into the family, and then it gets inherited out to outside of the church. So the church was losing wealth, and they did not like that. And they tried to make it like law that you, as a priest, and if you're a nun or a priest or a monk, like you had to be unmarried, you had to be celibate. And it's hard to, in that time period, it's not like now where you have so much communication and oversight and stuff. It took a lot of work to actually go around making sure everybody did it. And basically not everybody did it. And I would say so many priests had like mistresses in the villages and they had so many kids and stuff like that because they're basically going, hey, I'm not married, but then on the side, we're still doing this. Because at this point it was, like you had said, it was more political. It was not actually of the heart that a lot of people were doing this. So let's just stop here for a second. As we're coming into the early church, the view on asceticism and celibacy was so high. And what was crazy at this time is that as a woman, you would be considered one of two things. You would be considered like Mary, the mother of Christ, who, in their view, because they believed that all physical things were wrong, sinful, so she couldn't possibly have had sex. This is where the Virgin Mary comes in, because that diminishes a person, because it does in their view. So a woman could be like her. You're celibate and virgin pure. There's even stories going around that some of these women died as a virgin and then they entombed them and then they went back 50 years later and they looked just like they had done when they put them in there. There was no taint of death or anything because there's no rotting of the flesh. That's because they didn't have sex. So that was the idea. There's stories, if you read Bede's ecclesiastical history, it's very interesting. Yeah. So that's one woman. The other woman, they consider it like Eve, which was they considered at this point, the fall was all her fault, and it was sexual in nature. I guess the fruit was a metaphor. So she seduced Adam into having sex, which caused the fall. I'm sorry. Yes.
Wait, what?
That's
I know, right? And I'm wondering if all of our listeners are going, wait, what?
that was the view, is that was the original sin. Sex. And so Eve seduced Adam into sex. So therefore, as a woman, you fell into two categories. You were the virginal, celibate, holy Mary, or you were the seducing harlot Eve.
But isn't that verse in Genesis before the fall? Go forth and multiply, be fruitful and multiply.
I can't remember, but it's this. It may be. It's
sure it was.
There's a lot of that to back up that marriage and sex and things were created good.
Yes.
As part of life.
Yes, I do believe that. But how can they say?
And you got to realize too, you have to be fair to a lot of these people. The literacy rate is not super high. You're being taught a certain thing. many of our doctrines, our theologies have taken thousands of years to be developed, and by really smart people getting together and reading over stuff and struggling through it. So we have the benefit of hindsight. And so you're going to just basically listen to what the experts are saying, like what these holy Christians are saying, right? These ones that are living up on the next plane of holiness.
They must not have read the Bible either then.
They may not have, but they went from, it depends on their literacy and what availability of the scripture.
Because Genesis, starting at 27, says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. And God blessed them, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds. So that was way before the fall.
Yes.
Yeah, that was like 2 chapters.
I know, right? What the heck?
Yeah, so we have to understand that we do
She gets a bad rap.
I know she did get the bad rap. Yeah,
Mary did too, actually.
yes, because that's unfair to put that amount of. She went through.
She went through so much to be the mother of Jesus, and she was married to Joseph.
I'm sure
Yeah,
Joseph.
She just had to wait for the time of purity. It says, what about James, the brother of Jesus?
They say that it was stepkids.
Stepkids.
Yeah, that Joseph was married before, and these are his kids from the previous marriage. That's how they get around that.
What?
But they were teenagers. How
yeah,
could that?
that's just how they get around it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's
So
stretch that a bit.
What's that based off of, though? What's their justification for that? Like,
I have not researched that part. So it is the virginity of Mary is a Catholic doctrine. So you have to go back and see where they come from that. I have not researched that part. So that was it. So as a woman, that was what you got. If you had sex, even with your husband within marriage, you were seducing your husband to be like to his physical side. You're seducing your husband for the physical side. So then you are the Eve.
sounds like they didn't read the Old Testament.
So you're the harlot and the whore of causing these good men to sin and fall. And if you manage to fight back all of the men and choose to be single, but you had to go live like this celibate life, and it wasn't just like
We're a nun.
basically, yes, quite a few women went to become nuns in order to avoid unwanted marriages. So they weren't going there specifically because they believed they had faith to go there. There's people there that probably weren't even believers of any sort. They were just, that was their way of getting out of an unwanted marriage, because arranged marriages were very big in that time. So that's,
And it was usually a teenage girl to a much older man.
And to be a nun was way less exciting than it was to be a monk. Like, you had way less. You were given less of the church's money. You were worked much harder. It was not an easy life. So to choose that on purpose.
I wouldn't even be surprised if you were given anything at all. You were just given food and a roof, and that was probably it.
Yeah, pretty much it. And yeah, it was not a good life for women during this time. If you want to see, just research our church fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Aquinas, all these names that you're going to know, because they are going to talk about the evilness of women. So Aquinas talks about it going by the example of Christ, who both chose a virgin for his mother, remained a virgin, himself a virgin, and by teaching of the apostle, who counsels virginity as the greater good. So that's Aquinas on it. And
Augustine too, right?
Yeah, Jerome said virginity is natural, while wedlock only follows guilt. What is born of wedlock is virgin flesh. So basically, when you get married and you have a child, that child is born a virgin, and it gives back in fruit what the root has lost. So it's saying God is gracious enough to give you a virgin from your sin of non-virginity. So it was, yeah.
I'm lost.
But we see these are great church fathers. Let's see. Also, I have written down here, Augustine. I have said this, lest happily married fruitfulness dare to vie within virgin chastity, and to set forth Mary herself, and to say unto the virgins of God, she had in her flesh 2 things worthy of honor, virginity and fruitfulness. So she had the magical 2 things. She was a virgin, and she had a child. Impossible outside of God, and yet those are the 2 things he is saying that were to her honor. Women of that day had no win. Could not win. No, and to become a nun or to even become an ascetic was just a very hard life.
Yeah.
So it was
It
not.
led to the glorification of that.
Yes. And yeah, that's the role of a lot of women during that time was just to be trying to survive it, I think was probably what I would say.
And I wonder if that mindset still, I mean, I think we're trying to get rid of that mindset that women are the cause of
There's
men.
a stigma that's permeated because it's going to have stayed somewhat within the Catholic Church because they never broke away from it. And
But
even in society built off Judeo-Christian principles would have been taught this, and even the Reformed Church, not Reformed, but like Reformation Protestant Church coming from there would still be having lingering. That's the
Well,
thing, like the Reformation, it broke away like the big things, but it didn't necessarily have time to deal with all the little issues.
But if you think about even up to, I think maybe, I can't remember when they started to really fight this law, that if a woman was raped, people thought it must have been how she dressed. It was all her fault. She must have enticed the guy
Yeah.
and not realizing that rape is actually an act of violence.
Yeah. And
So that kind of attitude that if a man has sinned on a woman, it's got to be because she did something wrong. It's her fault.
and there's still that idea, like there's that, because the Me Too movement came through, but with the Me Too movement came the Church Too movement. So a lot of women came forward who were basically told to be quiet and not report any sexual harassment or rape or anything within the church. Because there's this idea like you can't make the men look bad. So the women have to.
So the women are still being blamed, even though it's not really our fault.
Yeah, exactly.
Because men are just as sinful.
Wasn't Adam like literally there and just witnessed the whole thing and did nothing?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Adam watched Eve
I don't
talk to Satan.
I think it just said that she came to Adam later. But irregardless,
We shouldn't carry all the blame for everything under the sun because
yeah, it's everyone has their own sin to deal with, and it's not a specific gender's reason for anything happening.
yeah, sin is not gender specific. How's that?
So this is the early church. Sounds wonderful, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So then we move into, is there anything to add on to there, David, before I move on to the Reformation?
This is our favorite part.
Sorry, I was just reading Genesis 3:6, which actually says, when the woman saw the fruit of the tree was good for food and the pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her and he ate it. So he was with her the
He was
entire
watching. He
With
was
nothing to stop it. So.
no, wait, don't touch. Okay.
So equal responsibility, Adam and Eve, men and women.
Yep.
Each person has their own equal responsibility for sin.
It's not like the joke says. Adam blamed the woman blamed the snake, and the snake had no leg to stand on.
So now we move into the Reformation. So this is the point. When the Reformation happens, the Protestant separate from the Catholic Church, aside from all of the blood and death that went on just from that. This is when the Catholic Church really put their foot down and made the celibacy requirement because the Protestants fought against that.
Okay.
So this is where the real split comes, where the Catholic Church as a whole is like, nope, you're a priest. That's it. You're a monk. You're a nun. Nothing. You're celibate. That's it. That's the rule. And the reformers of the time were basically saying, hey, wait, this isn't celibacy. Singleness is not the best way.
And if we know the history of the Reformation, most of the reformers were former Catholics who stepped away from the church, who did not believe in what the Catholic Church stood for on a lot of points because, well, they were learned men and were reading the Bible for themselves and going, hey, wait a minute, which is where Martin Luther started, because Luther was a monk.
Yeah.
Who later got married, had kids. And they did, but didn't they curse him to say that his...
Oh, they said then if a monk and a nun got married, their children would be deformed or something, but they were not.
They were normal.
He was a little worried, apparently. But
oh, was he?
So this is when we have this change. And actually, we want to assume that the pendulum swung all the way to the marriage side, but no. Martin Luther, Calvin, all these men of the Reformation, they actually said, hey, wait, the Bible doesn't say that singleness, celibacy is better than marriage and sex. It actually says they're the same. They're on the same level. Marriage is good. Singleness is good. Neither is better than the other. So when you read the reformers, anything that the reformers are saying, that's where they are. Their pendulum's in the middle. It hasn't swung over to the other side yet. It's in the middle. But like I said, this is when the Catholics really put their foot down and were like, nope, celibacy is the way to go. So who react to that as time goes on, the pendulum gets pulled to the other side. So as the Reformation as everything settles down, the dust settles, the new denominations are being formed, new beliefs are being formed. Then we start going, wait a second, marriage is better because the Catholics are saying that singleness is better. We can't be like the Catholics. Let's say that marriage is better. So to fight that, it's that they went to the other side so at the Reformation, the pendulum's going from all the way from the one side, it's coming down to the middle, which would be nice where it stayed, but it didn't. So then we move forward a few hundred years.
Okay.
Anything to say about the Reformation era, David?
Again, I'm struggling to wrap my head around some of this just because going back to Adam and Eve, it all stems from Adam and Eve. What makes these people who believe that they're being single, not being married and stuff, superior to those being married and stuff within the church? When Adam and Eve were the first people ever, wouldn't they be held to a higher standard as they were the first people to be placed on earth and created by God's hand? Wouldn't they technically be far superior than them? And yet they were married and were fruitful?
They had to be. The earth needed people.
Yeah, but it just looks like it just went a decline. And then people got dumber and dumber. So
It's just like those people who say that I know you're married and all that good kind of stuff, but you can't have sex. You have to be celibate even in your married life.
yeah, it's contradictions, because then if they're saying you can't even have sex while you're married, then
Why are
you
you
can have Adam and Eve again. And it's the people within that 5 books of the Bible.
Yeah.
So what? It magically became unlawful?
I think it did come out of this view, the asceticism that came out of stuff. Like it became, and then they had to, why is this better? And then they start going back and
I remember
extrapolating things in a correct way.
Yeah. Back when I was younger in the 70s, 80s, even though the sexual revolution was a happening thing, because it happened in the 60s and everybody free love and stuff, it was still considered dirty in a sense. So even in my time, you didn't talk about it because it's still dirty.
Taboo.
It's still taboo. Yeah. But you didn't talk about that because it's dirty.
Yeah. Into more modern times. So this is where the pendulum swings all the way over to the other side. And because of this sort of pushing of the Catholic Church for the celibacy, then the Protestant Church pushed back and we're like, no, marriage and kids, oodles of kids, that's the way you got to go. And everybody should be married, having bunches of kids, because we have to be fruitful and multiply. We got to do what the Bible says. So it became very difficult for people to be single because the church almost deified marriage at that point.
Yeah, it was the state of being.
It was the way to be the most holy.
Yeah.
The new super Christian was the married with kids Christian. And if you weren't, there was something wrong with you. Again, this is not specific theology taught. This is more implicit. It's not something that was ever taught, because if you ever said if you say to most believers, like, hey, is it okay that I'm single? They'd be like, yeah, it's fine. But that's not really how you feel.
No.
When you're in that environment.
No. Especially when, have you found anybody yet? Found anybody? Find a lot of people. Who am I supposed to find?
One that fixes you, makes you not single.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also like to comment, it was almost like the Reformation focused on marriage within monks and nuns and people who the Catholic Church saw like priests and stuff that were not allowed to marry. But as time went on, it almost generalized it for literally everyone. Church kind of just said, this applies to everyone. But it seemed there was a more direct direction towards people who were pastors, were nuns and stuff that the Reformation then said, look, even these people can have marrying kids.
Yeah.
So there was an emphasis on singleness, but I think it was more directed towards, from what I can tell, it was more directed towards priests and pastors and nuns and monks being able to marry.
I think it was more like a pushback against the forced celibacy.
Yeah, because they were basically like the reformers were saying, like Martin Luther and Calvin and all these ones were saying, like, no, they're not. It's not better. It's the same.
Yep.
They would just, if you read their writings, like that's what they say over and over. It's like the celibacy, singleness is not better than marriage. It's the same, on the same plane. And they were fighting against that push by saying this is their super Christian status and saying, hey, no, this is equal.
Yep.
And
but it's humans who have taken that to an extreme.
And then the reaction, because that's the reaction that the Catholic Church had to that, was like, hey, no, we were right. We're going to double down on that. And then as time goes by, then as they try to develop more Protestant theology, it became like, hey, we've got to fight against this. And as it seems to be in the church, when they fight against something, they go to the other option, completely other end of the spectrum, and it creates an unhealthy environment in a different way.
But the thing with the Catholic Church too is that they don't impose that singleness to their congregation.
No.
To their congregation, it's be married, have kids, and have a lot of birth control is not acceptable.
Yeah.
But it's to those who want to hold any kind of office in the church.
But they need to be those next level Christians. So because they need to be higher standard.
Yeah. And the people are just supposed to sit in the pews and listen to what everybody else says and go home and be the happy housewife and the happy husband and the kids. But my thing though too is, how has these crazy pendulum swings where you've got it's marriage everything and it's single everything, but how has that affected now in today's society, how that affects the Christian single person now? As we come out of all of that, we're trying to balance all of that. The single Christian nowadays is sitting there going, okay, so what's the answer?
The happy medium?
What's the happy medium?
So I think that's what one of the things we're trying to do as a ministry is we're trying to pull that pendulum away from that side and not let it go back to the other side. We're trying to pull it to the middle and being like, hey, singleness and marriage are just two stages, or not stages because that presumes that everybody can get them, but two states of being.
Yep.
You're single or you're married. You can't be both, and you can't be neither.
You're going to be one or the other.
You're going to be one or the other.
And you can be single. You're single at the start of your life. You can be married a part of your life, but eventually you are going to be single again.
Yes.
Because we don't die the same day.
Yes. We're not the Notebook. And somebody's going to end up single again for some reason in that relationship. And even when they talk about in the Bible, when the Pharisees, I think it was, or whichever one that had given Jesus the exciting example of a woman marrying a brother and he dies, and then she marries his brother and he dies, and she marries, it goes about 7 times, and you're saying, please don't marry that woman. I think there's a Black Widow thing going on there. Then they're going, which man is she married to in heaven? And Jesus, don't you know, like there is no marriage or giving in marriage. It's not even a thing. Like we know why you're saying this, but
heaven. Okay, so then in heaven, are you single or married?
You're single.
You're single.
You're married to God.
Yes. Both. Neither. Because marriage.
So y'all run into more problems like that then too. So then who are you married to, God or your wife, when you're on earth, kind of thing?
Yeah. And we look at marriage was an institution. Marriage, like was said, Pastor Justin said today, like marriage was given as an example, as an illustration of Christ and the church. It's a symbol. You don't need a symbol when the actual thing is present. So when we are actually
in the presence
of God, in the present, the symbol of marriage is no longer necessary.
Are those people saved are not in the presence of God then?
Which ones that are currently on earth?
People who are saved, people who believe in Christ. Are they not in the presence of God then?
Not in the heaven and of earth sense.
Would they have?
It's like what Paul says. Right now we see through a glass darkly, but then we will see fully. So we can't see Christ face to face right now. So it's when we see Christ face to face, that marriage thing,
when we're living that
will not be. But we have the Holy Spirit.
Yes. But we're still in the stage of the already not yet.
Yeah.
So
I haven't died. Have you?
I feel like that would imply that we're still separated.
no, because there's lots of ways that things that we're going to experience in heaven that we will never experience here on earth.
We can't even imagine what we will
But
experience.
even just when he says there's no death, there's no
Pain.
sorrow, there's no pain, like all these things, we're still experiencing them now because it's not yet been made the end of. And the symbol of the unity of Christ in his church hasn't come to fulfillment yet because there's still the church is still being gathered. And it's already not yet. That's the whole thing. It's the present, but it's the future. And one of the mysteries. But because that's why the marriage thing, it's a symbol. It's symbolic of Christ and his church. Like I said, if you actually have the thing, then you don't need the symbol. But we do not have the thing of being fulfilled in Christ as the church, because the church is still being gathered. So therefore, the symbol is still necessary. Yep. Okay.
All right.
That is the end of this podcast. Thank you for joining us. Please find us on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. Subscribe, leave a review, send us messages. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We are starting YouTube with preview clips, so you know what's coming up.
And you can comment on those too.
Please write us.
Yep. We would absolutely love to hear from you, our listeners, because it's encouraging and it's also good for us to know where we can improve.
Yeah, and what you're thinking.
What you
want to know or what you want to talk about.
Yep.
That's good.
That
So
too.
let's talk, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you for joining us.
Yep. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for another insightful episode of the Route 77 podcast. We hope that our discussion has shed light on the complexities of singleness and marriage within the Christian community and provided some valuable insights for your own journey as a single believer. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We're excited to announce that in our next episode, we'll be tackling emotions and feelings, such as the often experienced thought, I feel like I should be married. We'll explore the sources of these feelings and how to navigate them as a Christian single. You won't want to miss it. Until then, stay strong in your faith and remember to live your single life to its fullest.